Hello, I'm Mike Gilliam, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. I'm filling in for Sam Roberts. The war in Ukraine is underway. Russian forces are attacking the country on many fronts, but they're coming up against fierce resistance. The international community is taking punitive measures against Russia, ranging from sanctions to financial hits in all different sectors. But the conflict is already having wide-ranging global consequences, and not just for the people of Ukraine. As of this taping, there's no indication of a ceasefire or a resolution to the Russian invasion. Joining me now from Brussels to help us make sense of all of this, we have the chief diplomatic correspondent for the Times, Stephen Erlanger. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Stephen, the Biden administration has worked very hard to come up with sanctions and have unity with all of our allies on this. Does that unity seem to be holding at this point?
Well, it does. It seems to be even better because, frankly, the shock of this Russian invasion of, a peaceful Slavic country, Ukraine, which tries to be democratic, has shocked quite a lot of people. It's been a kind of wake-up call. There are real dangers in the world, and these last 30 years of complacency have just been punctured. So there is a sense that European security is at risk, that Europe needs the United States and NATO for its security, that it can't stand necessarily on its own. And what's been intriguing is how quickly the European Union's come together on sanctions, which of course are painful for European countries too. I mean, the question is how long that will last, but for now, it is holding, very much so.
One of the big questions about those sanctions was whether or not it would take a long period of time for Russia to actually feel the impact. Are they already beginning to feel that impact?
Well, they are. I mean, in the sense that the ruble has gone down its value by, depending on the day, 30 to 40%, which is a lot. It will damage their economic growth. Russian airplanes are no longer allowed to fly anywhere in European Union space. Russian teams are being pushed out of competitions. UEFA, the big soccer championship, has been moved out of Russia. So there are ways, symbolic ways too, that the Russian people understand they're being isolated, that their government is doing something that has offended the rest of the world. The problem in general with sanctions is they're priced in, and their biggest strength is in deterring something from happening. And in that sense, they failed. If the idea was to stop Putin from doing this invasion, they failed. Now they become not deterrence, but punishment. And it's punishment that, for now at least, has no effect on Putin's exercise of the war itself.
You touched on something that I wanted to get into just a bit, and that is a deterrent type of effect. At this point, are there things that need to be done militarily to try to stave off any further damage?
Well, it's a moral dilemma because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's a strategic partner. So it does not have the benefit of the collective defense commitment that NATO has. So in a sense, NATO's watching the war. Now, NATO and the European Union countries and 21 members of the 27 EU states are also NATO members, are as states funneling weapons into Ukraine through Poland, because that land border is still open. And they're hoping to help the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian fight back. But frankly, the question comes whether more should have been sent to the Ukrainians in the 2 months as the Russians were building up this army, and not wait until the war actually started. The worry was that, NATO somehow, this supply would provoke Russia, but Russia seemed intent on invading anyway. Now the question is, can they get enough weapons in to make a difference?
Yeah, many people have taken issue with the fact that they had a 40-mile convoy sitting on a highway there and nothing was done to stop that convoy.
Well, NATO isn't going to start attacking Russian planes over Ukraine. That could lead to a very big war very, very quickly. I mean, NATO has said very clearly, President Biden has said very clearly, we are not fighting Russia in Ukraine. So that's out. Some people have called for a no-fly zone, but that would mean dogfights with Russian planes over Ukraine. That would mean ground attacks on Russian air defense systems. I think, it's a superficially attractive but extremely dangerous idea. Now, what more can people do? They can give money to Ukrainians. They can provide clothing for refugees. They can welcome, Ukraine's fight for independence. They can do lots of things. But militarily, all we can do is try to help Ukraine with some weapons and money and hope they can beat back Russia for as long as possible, because the domestic cost for Vladimir Putin will go up over time. He cannot keep from his own people the fact that Russian soldiers are dying in an attack on their Slavic brothers who have made no attack on them.
Yeah, to an extent, it almost feels like anything from the West at this point, militarily, would basically bolster Putin, that he would be more aggressive.
Well, it could, in the sense that he has framed it in his own head, as he said publicly, that he has to defend Russia from NATO's interests in seducing Ukraine, putting offensive weapons into Ukraine aimed at Russia, even nuclear weapons. Now, NATO has no intention of doing any of that, but Putin does believe that to lose Ukraine from the Slavic world is a danger to Russia and himself. And so if NATO is too aggressive, it may provoke him further. But I think the whole point is NATO is working very hard to reassure its member states, which are bordering Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, to make sure deterrence goes up high enough that even an angry Putin doesn't test NATO's Article 5 collective defense commitment. Mm-hmm. So we're defending ourselves, and we're trying to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, but we're not doing it for them.
During his State of the Union address, President Biden said that Putin's war will have made Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Does that ring true?
It's good rhetoric. I don't know if it makes the rest of the world stronger. I think it may make the rest of the world weaker, but it does weaken Russia too, and it weakens Putin's hold on power, particularly if this continues to go as slowly and badly as it has gone so far for the Russian army.
What do you expect to happen over the next weeks and months?
I expect a more grinding Russian offensive, more artillery, more civilian casualties, trying to push the Ukrainian government into a choice, which is to essentially surrender to save its people, or to fight a sort of partisan war. I don't think Russia can afford to, quote, lose, unquote, in a very public way. I suspect this will grind on for some time.
Okay, that'll have to be the last word. Our thanks to Stephen Erlanger. And next, President Biden's State of the Union. Welcome back. Democracy was the centerpiece of President Biden's State of the Union address. While his speech touched on inflation, infrastructure, drug pricing, COVID-19, and other matters, it was the focus on freedom and democracy that took center stage.
Tonight, we meet as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, but most importantly, as Americans, with the duty to one another, to America, to the American people, and to the Constitution, and an unwavering resolve that freedom will always triumph over tyranny.
Joining me now to discuss is Emily Cochrane, congressional reporter for The Times. She's in Washington. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We saw something at the State of the Union that I haven't seen in quite some time, and that was bipartisan cheering for the president.
Yeah, the topic of Ukraine and the Russian invasion really brought folks together in a way that we haven't seen in a while, especially after the Capitol riots, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. It's really been a tense, dark year in the building, but coming together to show solidarity for the Ukrainian people was a big part of the State of Union. You saw it during President Biden's remarks when he spoke about the country and he spoke about the efforts to help counter what Russia is doing. And you saw it in the chamber, a lot of yellow and blue on both sides of the aisle. Staff passed out flags that they waved during the speech. It was a really striking moment to start off the speech.
Do you think that that can be built upon?
I think that's always the hope right now in Congress, that any moment, any glimmer of bipartisanship can lead to more unity. But as we saw, as the president pivoted away from talking about Ukraine and turned to domestic issues, it became a lot more partisan. You had, in particular, a lot of the far-right Republicans openly scowling and making all kinds of comments during the speech, even heckling him multiple times during his remarks. So it's always a moment that lawmakers will point to as a possibility for more, but almost immediately after, we saw that there are a lot more deeper divisions at home.
Yeah, it seemed to revert back to normal at that point, with some of that heckling taking on a very ugly tone.
I think a lot of people were shocked by how blatant it was, and also just sort of the timing of it. As at one point, as the president was talking about troops coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan in flag-covered coffins, he was pivoting to talking about the death of his own son and the possibility that his brain cancer had been connected to burn pit exposure overseas. You saw Lauren Boebert of Colorado interrupt him and say, "You put them in, 13 of them." There was an apparent reference to the death of service members in Afghanistan during the withdrawal, but Democrats and Republicans were quick to shut that down with some boos, particularly the Democrats.
One of the things the president wanted to do was to build unity with that speech and to get the American people behind not only what's going on in the Ukraine, but also his domestic agenda, which has been stalled here. Do you think he was at all successful on those two fronts?
There were some moments of bipartisan support. He talked about passage of the infrastructure law, which would not have happened without Republican support. You saw Republicans who helped negotiate that law stand up and applaud with Democrats. There was some bipartisan support for lowering the cost of prescription drugs. President Biden also made a point of saying that police should be funded, as opposed to the liberal slogan, defund the police, made a point of saying otherwise, we should be funding the police. And you saw Republicans and Democrats both give that a standing ovation. But a lot of the things he talked about, a lot of the domestic agenda he's prioritized was directly for Democrats. And you saw Republicans just sort of sit there stone-faced as Democrats gave him ovation after ovation after ovation.
Yeah, I thought it was important that he outlined some of his accomplishments over that first year, which he in fact did. But during that time, it seemed as though Republicans were not feeling that, so to speak, at all, that they just kind of sat there through that.
I think that is something we've seen in State of the Unions over the years, that the party that's of the president is far more raucous about what he's saying than the minority party. But it was striking how much Republicans, did not want to show that kind of positive support, especially when you looked at some of these hardline conservatives heckling, rolling their eyes, making thumbs down. You did see the moderates, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney, Utah. They were more likely to cheer for the bipartisan accomplishments, partially because those wouldn't have happened without their votes.
Do you feel that as far as Washington is concerned at this point, that we're at a better place today than we were, say, 2 days ago?
I think it's still early to say that. I think it's fair to say that more than a year after the riot at the Capitol, which was a very painful, traumatic, and divisive moment, not just for the country, but for the people in the building who survived the riot and had to flee the people who came to the building. That is a little more, it's not as raw as it was a year ago when President Biden gave his first joint address before Congress. I think there was definitely an effort to show a return to normalcy. The fact that there weren't masks in the house, up until a couple of days ago, there was a mask mandate in place. Lawmakers and staff had to wear masks, or for lawmakers, there was a threat of a very hefty fine. So there was a real concerted effort to show that there's a pivot in how people are living with the virus, and a pivot in how restrictive people are being on the Hill and at home.
How do you feel he handled the whole issue of the virus and making that particular pivot?
I think it's been a few weeks in the making. I think moderates in particular have been very anxious to show some progress and show that there's some form of normalcy as they look to the midterms. And I think President Biden gave them a lot of what they wanted to hear. He talked about the need to have, the need to keep schools open, the need to have a more normal life. And he also at the same time talked about the need to keep prioritizing vaccines. He said he was going to ask Congress for additional money to provide funds for testing and to prepare for another variant. So I think it was a blend that a lot of moderates in particular, who faced some of the toughest re-elections in November, were looking to hear from him.
In keeping with that whole theme of bipartisanship, before wrapping up, he talked about 4 things that he thought that people could get behind and agree upon. He talked about battling opioids, taking on mental health, support for veterans, and ending cancer. How did that ring in the chamber?
I think there was definitely bipartisan support for all those issues. As always in Congress, applause during a speech doesn't always translate to something that can get through both chambers. But I do think those are very personal issues for President Biden. They're very personal issues for a lot of people on Capitol Hill in both parties, and those in theory do stand a better chance than some of the other things he was talking about, in terms of universal pre-K, the child tax credit, and a lot of the things that Democrats had tried to push through on their own and have so far been unsuccessful in doing so.
Yeah, I didn't hear any support for voting rights or freedom of choice, that sort of thing. I want to thank Emily Cochrane for her help on this. And next up, the MTA. Here at home, the city has stepped up its plan to move homeless people off the subways with mixed results. The system is also beginning to plan a pilot program to install barriers on the station platforms that might increase riders' safety in the system. And the MTA's Fairfares program also made the news, but not in the most positive light. Ana Ley is a transit reporter with the Times and has been covering all of these stories and more. Welcome, Ana.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Thanks for coming on. Every day we see the stories out of the subway, and they seem to just get worse and worse. The Adams administration has been trying to address this. Do you think they have a handle on things right now?
Well, I think that there's a lot of frustration from riders that the subway just isn't safe right now. Ridership, of course, hasn't come back, from its pre-pandemic levels, and there's been a lot of high-profile violence in the system, and specifically, or perhaps most notably, at least recently, the pushing of a woman in Times Square by a man who didn't know her, who happened to be homeless.
Michelle Go.
Correct. Because the mayor campaigned so heavily on safety, and crime, the fact that these things are happening so early in his administration are not good for him politically. And, I've certainly spoken to many riders, I think especially women who women who are of Asian descent, who are very, very nervous right now about being in the subway.
I think one of the biggest concerns about that is ridership is down. There are fewer people down in the subways, yet the crime numbers are just soaring right now.
Correct, yeah. So, the rate of violent incidents is up, even though, as you mentioned, there aren't as many people in the system. And, of course, speaking with the officials at the subway system, they want more riders to come on so that, there are more eyes, right? So if there are more people riding the subway, then, you don't feel like you're the only one. And if there's someone who's on drugs or who maybe has, some ill intent, then it's not just you and that other person. And so the people who run the system, really just want people to come back. But of course, with commuting patterns changing, it's not really, it's not certain that that's ever going to happen.
It's ever going to happen. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. You mentioned Michelle Go and the fact that she was pushed onto the tracks and tragically killed. One of the things that they're talking about doing now is to put barriers into the subways. Talk to me a little bit about what the pilot program would be and what they're trying to accomplish there.
Yeah, so, the MTA for actually many years has been studying the feasibility of having these doors, these sliding doors. You see them in other systems around the world.
Like at airports, you will see.
Yeah. So airports in the United States tend to have them, but not very many, transit systems have them. In the United States and the Americas in general, they're not very common. But in Asia and Europe, you were waiting for the train, right? And so there will be these glass doors, right? And so the system, the MTA has been sort of trying to figure out if they make sense. And for many years, for a long time, they've said, they would be too heavy. And some of these platforms, especially like if you're like in Brooklyn, some of these platforms, and out in Queens, they're just quite narrow. And it's really, according to the MTA, tricky to put them in. And, if you've got a person in a wheelchair, it's taking up too much space. And so this was the argument that they were putting out for a long time. But then, this incident happened with Michelle Go. And, I think politically, again, there's just been a lot of push and also, just general people, right? Just the public is wanting to see something tangible. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of demand, for these platform barriers. And so now the MTA has said, we're going to try them out at these 3 stations. One of them is in Times Square on the 7 line. And so,
But I guess one of the problems with that is the expense. I mean, because to do this, first of all, you couldn't do it in all the stations, but this would cost billions of dollars, right?
Yeah, so these 3, tests, pilots, whatever you want to call them, they're going to cost more than $100 million, which I guess for the MTA's budget isn't that much, but if they were to expand this program to the stations that could eventually hold them, it would cost more than $7 billion, and that's a lot of expense to justify. And who knows if a few years from now people are going to be asking for them as much as they are now, right? Right. Things right now are fraught, I think, because of the crime rate. What if the crime rate changes, so it's really unclear, it's uncertain what's going to happen with these.
What about the effort to remove those who are homeless from the system?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, the mayor, announced that it was basically this program, this zero tolerance program to just kind of get homeless people out of the system, which, as you can imagine, is hugely controversial.
And difficult.
Of course. I mean, this is not a new problem. You run into so many problems. People who are homeless who don't want to go to a shelter. Maybe they don't feel like it's safe, or there's not enough freedom there, or you just run into so many issues. Forcing people out of a place that's warm when it's 20 degrees outside is also just really difficult. Mm-hmm.
Now, the mayor wants to put like 30 teams of police officers with a social worker down in the subways. Is that enough?
Well,
system.
I'm probably not the person to answer that question, but yes, the plan is for eventually 30 teams. So far I think they've had about 6 or 7, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a big system. It's a huge system. It's 472 stations. It's massive. A team of 30 people. I don't know.
Okay, almost out of time, but I want to touch on one other thing, and that is the Fairfares. Tell me about that.
Oh, so Fairfares is a program for low-income New Yorkers, and the idea is to give them a half-price Metro card. But you've got to make less than the federal poverty level, which is quite low. I think it's about $28,000 for a family of four. In New York, that is not a lot of money, and so there's been a big push from advocates to expand eligibility, to allow more people to benefit from this program, and also to give it more money. Because when this program was pitched, I guess, when Mayor de Blasio was in office, the plan was to fund it at $106 million. Then the pandemic happened, and then that was rolled back. And most recently it was about 53%, or 53 million, pardon me, so about half of what it was intended to be. Now Mayor Adams wants to bring it up to 75, which is still not what the advocates want. They're saying, this needs more money. This program could benefit a lot more people if we just funded it. And the head of the MTA also has been, putting some pressure on the city to do that, as well as a speaker. So I'm curious to see what the mayor decides ultimately.
We'll see where that one goes. I want to thank our guest, Ana Ley. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Mike Gilliam. Thanks for joining us.